Welcome to Would You Rather Die Rich or Live Richly? In this seminar, I'm going to challenge you to think about the following question. If you knew you had enough, how would you live your life differently? By way of introduction, my name is Monique Madan, and I'm a certified financial planning professional, financial management advisor, and chartered financial divorce specialist. And my services are provided through two channels, part of ETF Capital Management's suite of services for clients. And for those of you who are not part of ETF Capital Management and want a fee-for-service option, that is the UPotential business unit. In my time as a financial planner, the first and foremost question that almost every client will ask me is, will I be okay? In other words, will I outlive my money? And I think our fascination with this and our concern with this really does stem from the so-called riches to rags stories, where celebrities who make, many multiples of what we'll ever see in our lifetime and lose just as much. So here are some examples of some celebrities who've squandered fortunes. On your far left, there's Nicolas Cage, who was famous for having many multi-million-dollar homes. To his right, Larry King, who lost many millions of dollars through divorces. Then Johnny Depp, who was kind of considered the cash cow of his family and was taken advantage of by family members. To his right, 50 Cent, who was famous for being on the wrong end of litigation. And lastly, Charlie Sheen, who, chalked up not only 2 divorces and 4 children that he had to raise, but also, of course, had personal problems, making it very difficult for him to find work. And so, we hear about these fantastic and sensationalized stories, but really, these aren't the clients that I'm most worried about. The clients that I concern myself with really are those who have a good basis of capital to generate income and yet are still afraid that they're going to outlive their resources. In fact, they're paralyzed with fear. And that fear of financial insecurity can lead them to settling for a life far below what they deserve. So what I like to do is I like to educate and either reinforce the need to be cautious or, give people the reassurance that they can spend a little bit more. And in fact, I believe that history has taught us rightly that we do have to be a little bit cautious because there's an awful lot of factors at play that we can't control. For example, I read a book by the name of Think and Grow Rich, written by Napoleon Hill. And in one of the chapters, he talks about the costs of living in 1937, which is a few years after the Great Depression of 1929. And he's talking about a couple in New York who are having breakfast. And this is a menu of their breakfast items that cost a total of about 20 cents for the two of them. Now, if we were to attribute costs of living today only to inflation, if we were to attribute only inflation to the change in cost in today's dollars, we would expect that same breakfast 82 years later with a long-term average inflation rate of 3.18% to cost about $2.60. I don't know, I'd have to look at my grocery bill pretty closely to see if in fact breakfast for 2 at that same menu would actually be $2.61 in today's dollars, but I can show you another example that will make things much, much clearer. Take, for example, rent. In that same chapter, in 1937, the couple living in a 1-bedroom apartment in the Times Square district of New York paid about $65 a month in rent. Fast forward in today's dollars, again, 82 years later, at an average inflation rate of 3.18%, and we would expect that apartment to cost $850 a month. Now, I think we can all agree that in any desirable neighborhood of a major urban center in North America, it would be very, very hard to find a rental unit for $850 a month. So clearly, it's not simply inflation at play. There are other factors that we have to be careful of. And part of this is, of course, that we know a lot that that couple didn't know. We know that ahead of them is a Second World War, several financial crashes, including Black Monday in 1987, the uh, crazy increase in costs of real estate in the 80s, and then the subsequent drop, which no wonder we're nervous about today because we see those strong housing prices again. The tech bubble and burst at the beginning of this century, and of course, just a few years ago, the Great Recession and what I call the jobless recovery. So we know there's an awful lot that we can't predict, and as a result, we try to be extra careful. But I do believe that with the right information, we can live better without putting ourselves in peril. A lot of what I do is coaching clients on how to create a sustainable standard of living. And of course, this will differ whether we're in the pre-retirement period and potentially raising children and paying off mortgages, or after retirement, where hopefully many of those earlier burdens are behind us. That being said, there are obviously two very different strategies at play, whether we're in that pre-retirement period and can choose where to put our earnings, or later on in our lives when we're in retirement and of course we're on a fixed income because our earnings have ceased. Now, this is a great table in terms of it's showing us a pattern of our income versus a pattern of our sustainable expenses. The source of the information comes from the 2016 census, and I want you to focus on the green line first. The green line is showing sort of an inverted U pattern, and on the up and down axis, this is relating our average annual earnings as a nation to, on the horizontal axis, our age. So what the inverted U curve is telling us is that earlier on in our lives, we earn less than we do as, we gain experience, and there increases to be an appetite for our experience and knowledge up until we're in our peak earning phase, let's say between age 40 and 60, where we can command a better salary. Then as we move towards retirement, our incomes decline and ultimately go to a fixed income period during retirement. Now, you may not be able to relate necessarily to the average earnings that are posted here, but even for people who earn many multiples of the average earnings that are displayed in this table, we still see the same inverted U curve. Now, if we were to focus then on the blue line, the horizontal line, that's really this person's sustainable living, the annual amount of expenses that this income can support. Now, what's interesting is in the early years, let's say between 20 and 30, this client actually is spending more than he or she is earning. And that's actually pretty typical as we repay debts for our schooling or take on mortgages. A mortgage is literally borrowing against future earnings. Until such time as, let's say, it depicted in this graph, between 30 and 65, ideally our incomes should be in excess of our spending so that when we retire, our expenses can be supported by savings that we've made along the way. The trouble that I find is that many clients have their expenses, their spending, mirror or follow the same path of the inverted U curve that you see in the income line. In other words, we're not taking advantage of years in which our incomes exceed our expenses in order to subsidize our own retirements. As I coach clients on how to create that sustainable standard of living, I try to teach them to set up an optimal balance. And in my mind, that optimal balance reserves about 60% of your gross or pre-tax income for lifestyle expenses and debt payments, and then reserves 40% of the gross income for taxes and savings. Now, these two categories are grouped in this way because lifestyle expenses and debt payments are kind of two sides to a seesaw. The more we're still paying for previous debts, the less we can enjoy in terms of new goods and services that we can afford to buy. Similarly, the grouping of taxes and savings are kind of married because there are some saving strategies, namely the Registered Retirement Savings Plan, that will allow us to save taxes. Now let's delve a little bit deeper into the 60% portion. This is a really subtle and hard thing to wrap your head around. If you earn $100,000 and you're going to adhere to a 60% total living expenses budget, you really have to think as though you live like you earn, $60,000 a year. Now, what do I mean by that? I mean that we often mistake the amount that we signed on a contract to be the amount that we can spend or the standard of living that we can support. And it's very, very different because we earn in pre-tax dollars, but we spend in after-tax dollars. So we need to create a buffer. We need to change our mindset, ignoring the amount that we're reporting for taxes and really focusing on our net pay. And so if we assume that for most people, your taxes will erode something in the ballpark of 30% of your income, and at the same time, you need to create that buffer to allow for savings. In other words, remember, creating a situation where you're spending less than you're earning, well then you better stick to something in and around about a 60% lifestyle expenses and debt amount. If you need more specific information on how to create a budget of this sort, I'll turn your attention to my contribution to goldengirlfinance.com and an article I wrote on creating a budget of this sort. Now let's switch gears and think about what happens once we do retire. Now, I don't want there to be any question that going from a regular income to slowly drawing down your own wealth is incredibly frightening. And I empathize with those who are in this situation, and that's why I really do think that knowledge is power. Like many things in life, knowledge is key. So in order to determine what your retirement sustainable lifestyle would be, I go about a calculation that I've called the maximum sustainable budget. This calculation tells the household how much you can afford to spend on an inflation-adjusted basis every year without exhausting your investment resources before age 90. Why am I focusing on the investment resources specifically? Because I'd like to preserve, for those of you who have a principal residence, I do try to reserve your home equity for the costs of private nursing or assisted living or for distribution through your estates. The key piece to this calculation, though, is the fact that it's inflation adjusted. And so I do take a long-term inflation rate and project it into the future in the hopes of being able to protect your standard of living every year going forward. Now, what do I find anecdotally about presenting the maximum sustainable budget to clients? Well, it gives them some freedom to dream a little bit. If there's experiences, trips, articles, items, leisure activities that you're not doing for fear that you're going to run out of money, this gives you an idea of whether your current standard of living is at, below, or in sometimes above what you can afford. For many, it gives them permission to tackle that bucket list, go to the destinations that they didn't have time to go to when they were working, or share more of their money with the next generation. Again, anecdotally, I'm hearing more and more from parents that they would much prefer to help their children with, let's say, smaller gifts during their lifetimes rather than leaving them a significant estate when they pass away. Because for most clients, their children would only be getting that bequest once they're already established themselves. Now, you never really make money by giving it away, but it is very interesting to see how sometimes spending a little more over time can actually help you control taxes. Let me show you how. I'm going to focus on this first graph on top here. This happens to be the male spouse of a family, and this is sort of a before and an after situation. Each of these bars, each of these blue lines here represents the percentage of this client's income that's paid in taxes. So this first line represents 2019, the second line is 2020, etc. These green lines are the marginal tax rate, which is what we look at from a tax planning point of view. This client happens to be in his pre-retirement period, so naturally we see very, very high taxation now. Then, if he does what most of us are coached to do, which is wait until age 72, which happens to be here for this client, to withdraw from his RIF, then he's in a lower tax bracket in retirement. We learned two things from this particular graph. Firstly, this reduction in pre-retirement income, which is at a very high tax bracket, and then lower taxation in retirement, is what we call conversion. And that's the telltale sign that RSP contributions remain valuable. But we also see something else. We see a prolonged period here of intermittent low taxation before he begins to withdraw from his RIF. And we want to take advantage of that. We want to see what would happen if we moved some of this income and withdrew it in these areas here, in other words, filling in this gap. And that's what we see from the bottom graph. We see a much shorter period of time of lower taxation, and then getting up to this retirement tax level a little bit sooner. So you might ask me, well, Monique, that doesn't sound like it helps me any. Why would I want to pay a higher tax rate earlier? Well, this is why. So this would be this gentleman's spouse, who happens to be a woman. And again, the top graph is a before, the bottom graph is an after. Same thing for this client. This is 2019 and 2020, and then these are her marginal tax rates in green. She too is in a pre-retirement period, but you'll see that her pre-retirement tax rate is very similar to the tax rate that she sees in most of her retirement. What we don't see is the conversion from highly taxed income to low taxed income that we saw with her spouse. We don't see it here. We see something else, though, that's even more troubling. We see very, very high tax level later on, in well in excess of what she was paying when she was working. And this is as a result of the fact that in most cases, women tend to outlive their husbands. And as a result, in these years where she has now taken on his assets, she can no longer income split with anybody. And as a result, ends up in a very, very high level of taxation. So in the after scenario, where we've encouraged this client to live a little bit better, maybe share a little bit more, do income splitting and all sorts of great things, again, we've shortened the period of time where she had her trough, but as a result, we've all but eliminated that incredibly high punitive tax later on. As a result, you might be surprised to hear that this family actually saves about $250,000 in tax. Now, it's not always unicorns and rainbows. Sometimes the maximum sustainable budget is lower than the standard of living that you're currently enjoying. And again, I think sometimes that knowledge is important too. First of all, you could decide to adjust your standard of living now, Or with that knowledge, you could say, well, you know what, I'm going to take advantage of my good health and I'm going to continue to travel and to play golf and to eat out for the next 10 or 12 years with the understanding that as my body begins to slow down, I'll be doing those things less frequently. To be perfectly honest, I don't know how anyone could retire in peace without knowing this type of information. And so you might say, but Monique, things change. And I would say to you, of course they do. You could be in a situation of a personal circumstance like a divorce or a significant cost or things of that nature. You could run into a horrible market fluctuation. You could have a horrible health situation. So, of course, this isn't a one and done situation. Of course, I would have to monitor this and help you recognize that what you can afford in some years, you may have to adjust for a period of time in those years of market fluctuation in order to preserve and make sure that you're not withdrawing, copious amounts of assets when those assets are depreciated. So that's why it's so very important to monitor your maximum sustainable budget. If I can help you keep track by, meeting up with you every year or 18 months and coaching you through when your portfolio can support a higher lifestyle or a lower lifestyle, then you can then turn around and make decisions on how to create and sustain that optimal standard of living the true you potential. Once again, my name is Monique Madan. I am the head of financial life strategies at both UPotential, which is the fee-for-service business unit, and ETF Capital Management, and it would be my pleasure to help in any way that I can.